What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to bust some commonly held myths about transgender people in hopes of stopping the spread of misinformation. Most of the information society has about transgender people doesn't actually come from us. It comes from cis people, meaning those who aren't trans. There are several reasons for this. Cis people largely outnumber trans people, and being part of such a small minority makes it harder for our voices to be heard. Most gender-affirming healthcare has been provided by cis people, so the research and experience those cis providers have positions them as the experts. Most portrayals of trans people in media have come from cis creators, so even though those stories are about trans people, they're clearly by cis people for cis people. It's only in the last decade or so where we've seen a major rise in trans visibility that we've also seen a rise in more trans people telling our own stories and putting our own voices and experiences out into the world. Time magazine noted this increase in visibility with their transgender tipping point issue featuring Laverne Cox in 2014. But because so much of the general public consciousness of trans people came from a cis perspective before that, it's left trans people in the position of now having to correct a ton of misinformation, misunderstandings, and misconceptions. And because we've seen a rise in anti-trans bigotry right on the heels of that rise in trans visibility, correcting those misconceptions has now become crucial to our survival. In the US where I live, multiple states have passed laws infringing on trans rights. And when you look at the text of those laws, there's a ton of misinformation about trans people baked right into them. This really goes to show the importance of the phrase, "nothing about us without us." If trans people's voices had been prioritized in the dominant cultural narratives about us, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. But we can't undo what's already been done. The best we can do at this point is try to fix things by getting our own voices out there and counteracting all that misinformation with the truth based on our lived experience. So that's why I'm here with this video, to clear up some misconceptions, or cisconceptions if you will, and bust 10 commonly held myths about the trans and non-binary community. Myth number 1. Being trans is a choice. Being trans is an inherent part of who someone is. You don't get to choose your gender or whether it aligns with your assigned gender any more than you get to choose your height or your eye color or your skin color. If you do happen to be trans, the only choice is what you do about it. Do you transition to affirm your gender? If so, what path does that transition take? And even though that's a choice you have to make, it's a much more limited choice than most people realize. You might be limited by your finances, your health, your living situation, or your local laws, just to name a very few things. But regardless of whether you transition or how you transition, being trans itself is not a choice. Myth number 2. Trans people are changing their gender. From an outside perspective, when you see people changing things like their name, their pronouns, the way they dress and style themselves, the gender marker on their ID, etc., then it probably looks like they're changing their gender. But when trans people make these kinds of changes, what we're actually doing is affirming the gender we already are. What makes us trans is that we were assigned one gender at birth based on our external anatomy, but our actual gender turned out to be something else. So we change whatever we need to change on the outside to match who we really are on the inside and live our lives as our most authentic selves. Myth number 3. Transitioning is what makes you trans. It's a common misconception that you're not really trans until you transition, that it's the act of transitioning that makes you trans. And as a result of this belief, you might hear people ask, "Oh, so you're trans now after you transition?" Or erroneously refer to your pre-transition past as before you were trans or back when you were still cis. But the truth is, a person is still trans whether they transition or not. And this idea that transition is what makes someone trans erases and fuels disrespect toward trans people who haven't transitioned for whatever reason. All trans people deserve respect before, during, and after their transitions, as well as if they're unable to transition at all. Myth number 4. You need gender dysphoria to be trans. Much like the idea that transition is what makes you trans, there's a similar misconception that gender dysphoria is what makes you trans, or that you need dysphoria to be considered a real trans person. But it's not actually gender dysphoria that makes you trans, it's gender incongruence. Gender incongruence refers to that mismatch I mentioned earlier between your assigned gender and your actual gender. Gender dysphoria is distress you experience as a result of that mismatch. And not all trans people have dysphoria about their assigned gender. Some trans people only have gender euphoria when their true gender is affirmed. Other trans people, myself included, have a mix of gender dysphoria and euphoria. Gender dysphoria and euphoria vary from person to person, but what all trans people have in common is gender incongruence. Myth number 5. Medical transition is the only real transition. One of the reasons we have the myth that you need gender dysphoria to be trans is because of how trans people access gender-affirming healthcare. If you need to transition medically to affirm your gender, then you typically have to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before you can be prescribed hormones or approved for surgery, especially in the absence of informed consent-based healthcare. So as a result, we get this mistaken idea that medical transition is the only real form of transition, and that those who have gender dysphoria and need medical treatment for it are the only real trans people. But transition isn't just medical, it can also be social, changing your name, pronouns, and appearance, or legal, changing your name in the court system and updating the gender marker on your ID. All forms of transition are equally legitimate, whether it's medical, social, legal, or some combination. And no two transitions are alike. Claiming that medical transition is the only real form of transition is not only unfair to trans people who transition in other ways or who don't transition at all, it also ignores how difficult and expensive gender-affirming healthcare is to access. Myth number 6. Gender-affirming healthcare is cosmetic. Speaking of medical transition, there's a specific myth about that, which is that gender-affirming healthcare is cosmetic. And where this myth comes from is a mix-up between cosmetic and elective. Hormones and surgeries are something that a trans person may elect to do, but that doesn't mean that those treatments aren't medically necessary and life-saving. Instead of thinking of gender-affirming healthcare as cosmetic, it makes more sense to think of it as reconstructive. It may not be a dire emergency medical need like intensive care treatment after a car accident would be, for example, but gender-affirming healthcare is something that many trans people require to improve their overall quality of life. So that's what makes it medically necessary, and the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, whose guidance I have linked in the description, agrees. Myth number 7. No amount of medical transition will actually change your sex. With so many people believing that gender-affirming healthcare is cosmetic, it's easy to see where we also get the idea that medical transition can only change your body on a surface level. That no matter what hormones you take or what surgeries you have, you will always still physically be your assigned sex at birth. But the truth is that physical sex is complex, and medical transition can change certain aspects of it in pretty significant ways. Physical sex consists of primary sex characteristics, what reproductive organs you have. Secondary sex characteristics, traits like breast growth, hair patterns, changes to the voice, hormones, testosterone or estrogen dominance, and chromosomes. The only one of those things medical transition can't change is your chromosomes. And most people don't even know what their chromosomes are unless they get tested. They just guess based on their other sex characteristics. All of the visible and tangible aspects of physical sex can be changed with hormone replacement therapy and surgery. That's the whole point of why those treatments exist. Myth number 8. Children are too young to know that they're trans. When a young child starts showing signs of gender incongruence or expressing feelings of gender dysphoria or euphoria, Many people are quick to say, "You're too young to know. It's a phase. You'll grow out of it. You'll change your mind." The bills and laws in various states across the US that prohibit minors from accessing puberty blockers or transitioning socially in school are built on this myth that children can't possibly know they're trans, so they shouldn't be allowed to begin transitioning until they're adults. But the truth is that you can realize you're trans at any age. Many trans people realize it during puberty, when the changes to their bodies sharply bring their gender incongruence to light. And it's funny how no one says that kids are too young to know they're not trans, just too young to know they are. If this logic actually held water, then we would be giving puberty blockers to all children until they turn 18 because they're too young to know what gender they are or how to handle puberty. But of course that's not what we do, which really goes to show that the myth that fuels this mindset is rooted in transphobia. Myth number 9. Adults who transition later in life should have figured it out sooner. Even though we have this myth that children are too young to know they're trans, we also have a dominant cultural narrative that trans people know who they are from a young age, and that people who don't realize they're trans until they're older must not really be trans, or else they would have figured it out sooner. But again, you can realize you're trans at any age. Every trans person's journey is different, and it's influenced by many factors. Maybe someone didn't figure it out until they were older because they grew up having no frame of reference for what being trans was, or they repressed any unusual gender feelings they had due to social stigma, or they didn't have enough gender dysphoria to clue them in until some form of gender euphoria made their feelings clear. That doesn't make them any less trans, it just makes them a late bloomer. Myth number 10. You can make yourself stop being trans. The first myth I busted was that being trans is a choice, and that's also where we get this last myth. If we believe that being trans is a choice, then we also believe that you can choose not to be trans, perhaps through therapy or willpower or prayer. Many trans people have tried that, sometimes of their own volition, more often via coercion, but either way, it never works. That's because being trans is an inherent part of who someone is, and it can't be changed. If you try, the only thing you'll succeed in doing is repressing it. Repressing transness doesn't alleviate gender dysphoria, boost gender euphoria, or resolve feelings of gender incongruence. The only thing that can do that is affirming your true gender in whatever form that takes. For most of us, it's some form of transition. Repressing your gender causes harm, and affirming your gender improves your quality of life. Every major medical association agrees with this. So no matter how hard anyone tries to repress us or convince us to repress ourselves, trans people will always be trans and will always be here. And there we have it. 10 myths about trans people busted. Before I close this one out, I want to say that before I realized I was trans myself, I believed all of these myths, because they were the dominant cultural narrative and I had no way of knowing any better. And that's an incredibly common experience for trans people. When society says cis is the default, then that's what most of us think we are until we realize we're trans and prove otherwise. In that social landscape, we learn to perceive trans people as the other, which can make it hard for us to process our own transness. We have to dismantle all the transphobia we've absorbed from the world around us and internalized, which is incredibly difficult work. Especially when we have to do that on top of fighting a ton of social and legal and medical gatekeeping just to live as our true selves. So I think it's just as important to bust these myths for the sake of helping trans people process our own transness as it is for helping cis people understand us better. If you know anyone who believes any of these myths and could learn something from this video, please feel free to share it with them. And with that, now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. What are some myths about trans people that you've heard or maybe even believed? Because I know the ones I covered are not an exhaustive list. What myths about trans people do you think are the most harmful? What are some good ways that you think trans people can get our own voices out there to counteract these myths? And what questions do you have about all this? drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support. I hope this gave you some new perspectives, and I will see you on the next one.